2/3 full, and if there's a trial, it's crammed full. Because that's their entertainment. There's no television, there's no radio. It's the court. And that's why I wanted to be a lawyer. I thought everybody'd be there, and I started having trials. Nobody came. Nobody came. Heck, now they see it on TV. You can't compete with OJ. So, nevertheless, it's Courthouse. Sam goes upstairs. The courtroom is upstairs. He goes upstairs to the courtroom. He sits around. He waits for the sheriff to complete his duties. He talks to him up in the courthouse right at the last, before lunch. And they go downstairs together and walk down the steps, and they go into the sheriff's office. Very interestingly, Sam got away before he went upstairs to the courtroom. He had his gun with him. It was an Army Colt 1940, 45. About 1940. I think it's 1910. 1911. Semi-automatic. You know what it is. That's the kind of gun he had. And he put it in the safe in the sheriff's office. Because I suppose you didn't want to take it into the courtroom. So he and the sheriff come back into the sheriff's office. I'm going to say, I can barely remember that sheriff's office. I'm going to say it was probably just about half as big as this room, or maybe 3/4 the size of this room. And there were at least 8 people in that office that day. And so Sam and the sheriff then begin their conversation. And depending on who you believe, the conversation was very loud and boisterous, or you hardly heard anything. That's what makes trials. That's why, and it depended on who testified and whose side they were on as to how loud they were. Sam said it was pretty loud. On the other hand, the sheriff's brother was in the room, and he said, I could hardly hear him. So you have all that happen. But anyway, at some point, after about 10 minutes in there, Sam goes over to the safe. He takes his gun out. He starts to leave. All of a sudden, he turns around and fires that gun 3 times and hits the sheriff. The first one is right here, and that kills him. Comes over and he shoots 2 more times. He shoots 3 times. That's the Marine way of doing things, as I've understood. Most of you may have been Marines, but you shoot to kill. And he shot him head on. And then the very interesting thing happened after this book was written. They started selling in Mayfield. And I got a phone call from a man whose name is George Wright. And he lives at Lowe's, and Lowe's is north of Mayfield, near where Alvin Barkley actually was born, and near where Skaggs, who was the officer. He said, I'm amazed that you've written this book. He said, my daddy was 7 years old when this happened. And my daddy has told me this story many times before he died. And Daddy was in that room the day that shooting took place. And he said, what he told me was exactly what you had. Well, mine was factual. It came out of the newspapers. I knew I had it pretty right. I got not only newspapers, but other sources. But he said, I was sitting in the window of the courthouse. Now, in the Mayfield courthouse, you could sit in the window and you could jump out. You'd have to jump about 6 feet. It wasn't very far to the ground. He said, my uncle was Norman Carr, who was the deputy sheriff. And Norman had been in World War I. And the minute, though, that firing happened, he said, my Uncle Norman knew exactly what that was. He knew what those shooting was. And he said, Uncle Norman ran and just pushed me out that door, out the window. And he jumped out too. And he said Norman, who was the deputy sheriff, came back around to the front part of the courthouse. And when he came to the front part of the courthouse, he came into the hallway, and Sam Galloway was walking out, and he had the gun, and he had it down. And he said, "Sam, hand me that gun up." Norman took him to the jail, and actually he gave the gun to the jailer. He kept it that over. I don't know if any happened in Madisonville or the surrounding counties, but I know there were some in the Jackson purchase. There were two almost in Paducah, and one in Murray that Bill Cunningham's written about. And but anyway, so the judge knows that he's got to get Sam Galloway out of Mayfield. So somebody don't go in, and they take justice in their own hands. So he orders that he be taken to Paducah for safekeeping. It's 25 miles from Mayfield to Paducah. They went on a gravel road. If there was a heavy rain, it took them 2 hours to get there. Sam Galloway talks to some of the deputies on the way. And the only thing that Sam says, the real interesting, he says a lot of things, but he says, well, he said, I don't get the words exactly. I have made a hell of a mess. 2 women's lives are going to be ruined, talking about his own, because of what happened today. But he called me words I could not bear. Very interesting. Honestly, didn't come home to me until later. He called me a yellow dog. Now, that's not a yellow dog Democrat. In those days, that meant a coward. And so he said, in front of all those people, he called me, this ex-Marine, he called me a coward, and I couldn't bear it, and he flew off. My son Don said, "Yep, it's like Bobby Knight, Dad." He said, Bobby Knight can argue with the referees all night long, but when he threw that chair, it was over the top. And I think probably Sam just absolutely lost it. But regardless, then the next thing that happens in this scenario, and then I'll close it up, is that almost immediately after this happens, after the shooting, it's the county judge that has to appoint the new sheriff. Let me go just a little further. It was a massive funeral. It was a military funeral. He was a Mason. There were Masons there. They was a member of every organization. Everybody was in some organization. They all were at the funeral. The Mayfield Messenger said there were absolutely thousands of people at the funeral.
Kurt Burns Sr. had it?
Kurt, there was a Byrne who was in the business at the time, and he was the undertaker who came and got Sam.
Oh,
interesting. And the Byrne's still on the funeral home.
That's right, perfect.
Yeah. So, but anyway, this huge funeral. The Methodist Church is absolutely crammed. It has just been built. It's 1919. It's a beautiful church. It's a beautiful church today. It's still there. I've given lay talks in it. But anyway, it was a big time funeral. Well, but by the time of the funeral, the county judge all of a sudden has this 3,000 people have signed a petition saying that they want John Roach's wife, Lois, to be the sheriff. Now you put yourself in the shoes of a local county judge. It was his 3rd term. Old county judges, my granddaddy was one, and they were wise old birds. They were the wise old men of the county. And here all of a sudden, women could never vote. And now they're saying, we want to appoint a woman as a sheriff. And the judge, and the county judge said, how am I going to get out of this? Because I know, and he says this, he says it, I know if I appoint her, this will all subside in 30 days, and I'll be the joke of the country. I'll never be reelected again, appointing a woman for sheriff. At that time, there was some desperado that was loose, they couldn't find him. He committed murder, and they were trying to find him. So can you imagine him a woman going to arrest him? So he tries everything. But he says this. He said, but when I met her, she was different. She talked to me like a man would talk to me. She's a farm girl. And he goes, and it turns out she was very, very bright. She graduated from Western, a great teacher in her life. So anyway, he appoints her sheriff. She becomes the first woman sheriff in Kentucky, and I think perhaps the first woman sheriff in the country. There may have been one in Texas, but she's the first. And then in 2 years after she, or maybe about a year and a half,